Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a 100-year piano concerto sampler. And the 100 years in question, well, it's roughly 100 years. We can go a little bit more on either end just to make the point. What we used to call in the history business, actually, they still call it in the history business, the long century, meaning, yeah, okay, we don't have to be dogmatic about exactly 100 years. So we're dealing with the 1730s to the 1840s. And wow, what a change came over music in that 100 years. Because from that point, we move from the starting point, we move to the high Baroque to the early Romantic period. And the music is completely different. It's really astonishing. I've been actually thinking about how is it possible that there is so much variety, so much change in such a short period of time, relatively speaking. And one of the things that I think has come over us as we live in the modern age is this gross homogenization of everything. Why? Because of electronic media, because of communications, because of the simultaneity with which everything communicates over the airwaves and over the computers and everything we've got and digibits and whatnot. It has created a sameness of style, of knowledge, whereas back in the day, everything was local. Everything. And people knew or didn't know. And these styles that we now claim are universal were never universal. They're actually completely local. I mean, the first Viennese school, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, we call it the first Viennese school. Now we regard it as the universality of classical music. But it wasn't. It was a bunch of schmoes in Vienna, a city of 100,000 people or so, not that many people, tiny populations doing extraordinary things, which we later value and universalize. So we have to keep in mind that one of the reasons that these stylistic changes happened is because what was happening in Leipzig may not be what was happening in Paris, may not be what was happening in Milan, but we only care about what was happening in Leipzig. So we don't care about Paris or Milan, and that becomes the universal style. Nowadays, of course, things are indeed much more universal, and for the stylistic divergences that would be been quite common in the world of classical music, you look in today in international musics, popular musics, but not the classics, because the classics has become a completely rigid, academicized, and uniformly boring universe, frankly. Anyway. It doesn't mean that there won't be some wonderful music written and whatnot, but it does mean that wonderful, tangy, zesty, stylistic ferment that created these great individuals to percolate to the top and later become the universal standard, well, that's not going to happen the way it used to. It just can't. It absolutely can't. So, what are we talking about? 100 years of concertos, and we begin with piano. Well, I'm talking about piano concertos, keyboard concertos, okay? And keyboard concertos, well, we know when they started. It's so convenient because Bach invented the keyboard concerto for all intents and purposes. It's just fabulous that we can put a point at the beginning. And so we begin with J.S. Bach, his keyboard concerto in D minor, BWV 1052. Remember that number, 1052. That is Bach's greatest keyboard concerto. It's a grim, relentless, dark. It was in my list of pieces I still don't get, actually. But whether I get it or not isn't the point. The point is that it's his greatest keyboard concerto, and everybody agrees with that, and I agree with that. It's an astonishing piece of music. I just find it emotionally really, really gripping and intense, almost hard to listen to, frankly. But it's a fabulous piece of music, and someday I will probably have it all in my brain and then be much happier listening to it than I am now, but everybody loves it. I'm just a weirdo. I'm an outcast. So there we go. That's where the keyboard concerto gets its start. And now we continue over the next 100 years or so. After J.S. Bach, there was his son, C.P.E. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel, who wrote 60 some odd keyboard concertos, and they're wonderful pieces, absolutely wonderful. In fact, the invention of the keyboard concerto was sort of a family project, because at the same time in the 1730s that Bach was finalizing the D minor concerto and his group of 7 or so, solo keyboard concertos, his son C.P.E. was writing his first keyboard concertos. And while Bach's were mostly adaptations from other pieces, C.P.E. Bach's were all original works. And so, you could just see them all sort of sitting around at Zimmerman's coffee house going, oh, well, let's do this. We're going to do that. It was a family project. And C.P.E.'s keyboard concerto in D minor, Wotken 23, remember that number, Wotken, that was the guy who did the catalog, Wotken 23, because there are a few keyboard concertos in D minor. You don't want to mix them up. Number 23. Oh, what a powerful, gripping piece in a totally different style from that of his father. However, what all of these keyboard concertos have in common is that they are all versions of what we call ritornello form. It sounds very complicated, doesn't it? It's not. A ritornello is something that returns. That's why it's called a ritornello. It's a theme, the main theme of the piece. And what happens in ritornello form is you have the main theme of the piece, and then there's a solo, and then the ritornello comes back, and then there's another solo, then the ritornello comes back, and there's another solo, and then the ritornello comes back, and it's over. Basically, that's ritornello form. It has like 7 sections, 3 solos and 4 ritornellos, or something like that. Some version of that. And it's exactly the same form as that of the operatic aria in the Baroque period, where the orchestra does an introduction, the singer sings the text, the orchestra does an introduction, the singer sings the text. They do that a few times, and there you've got your aria. So it's basically a vocal concept. The soloist is the singer, the orchestra is the orchestra, the accompaniment, and also sometimes an alternative protagonist, which we'll get to more in a moment. So with that, we have the Baroque ritornello form. The classical ritornello form adapted this idea to the nascent concept of sonata form. Sonata form, which has 3 parts: an exposition, a development, a recapitulation. A sonata form is a ritornello form if it's a concerto, in which what happens is that you have the big long introduction, and then you have your first solo. But the solo does what's called a double exposition, because in sonata form you have to have a first subject, a group of themes, a second group of themes in a complementary key, and none of that gets worked out until the solo comes in and repeats the themes of the exposition and brings their own themes and does other stuff too, and organizes the movement in the shape of a first subject, a second subject, and all that. Now, you're not going to hear this in a sort of strict way. It's not like the music lights up. It says, aha, second exposition, everybody. Ha ha, ta-ta, there you go. You just listen to it. But what you hear as a result of this whole process, and the result is what matters, not the plumbing, not the infrastructure. What matters is that the orchestra becomes an independent actor in this evolutionary process, or dramatic process, dialogue with the solo, much more so than in the ritornello form, where things just sort of alternate side by side. Whereas in the classical period, the orchestra is a personality and the solo is a personality. And you may notice that in our 3 classical concertos. Those are by Haydn. Haydn wrote piano concertos. He wrote like 11 of them. He was not at his most Haydnesque in piano concertos. He wasn't really a concerto guy. He was a symphony guy, as you know. And after you heard Mozart's concertos, you sort of gave up the whole enterprise. But he did write he wrote a couple really good ones. And the last one, number 11, it's in D major. And it has a Hungarian finale, a finale in the Hungarian style, which Liszt would soon make popular in his Hungarian rhapsodies. But Haydn used a lot of Hungarian folk music, and it's a delightful, delightful piece of music. It's just fantastic. Alicia de la Rocha used to play it all the time, and she did it really beautifully. I saw her perform it a couple of times. So Haydn's keyboard concerto number 11. But then we get Mozart. And with Mozart invented the form I just told you about. the classical / ritornello form. It really was Mozart who brought it to its highest point of development, even greater than Beethoven. And he wrote 27 piano concertos. So there's a lot of them to choose from. I choose number 23, which is one of the most popular, because it has a second subject that always sounds like the Heineken beer commercial. Da 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 da. Well, that's Heineken, but the Mozart's a little different. But it's sort of the same tune. The old Heineken beer commercial. Whenever I see that windmill turning against a Harlem sky so clear, suddenly I get a tremendous yearning for that special taste of Heineken beer. Well, that sounds like Mozart's 23rd Piano Concerto. And it's a huge masterpiece. And everybody loves it. And it's in the new sonata / ritornello form, as is Beethoven's third Piano Concerto in C minor. A wonderful piece in Beethoven's early Sturm und Drang style, full of turmoil and tension, and it's just delicious. It was also the model for the Brahms first Piano Concerto, which we're not going to get to because our survey ends before those. So there you go. After Beethoven, there's this wonderful intermediate phase that everybody gets overlooked because everybody wants to jump ka-ching straight into the Romantic period. But we would be doing that, I think, a little bit too hastily, because I have a couple of absolutely gorgeous proto-Romantic piano concertos, one by John Field and the other by Hummel, who was, Mozart's student, or sort of, Mozart follower. But John Field invented the nocturne, as in Chopin's nocturnes, those poetic, dreamy, beautiful, slow piano pieces. He was an Irish composer who spent most of his career working in St. Petersburg, actually, in Russia. And he wrote 7 piano concertos. And number 2 is the most famous of those. It has some audible Irish folky type influences in it. And it's just lovely. Absolutely lovely. But it's worth pointing out, after the classical period, the form began to loosen up. I mean, Mozart's concerto form and Beethoven's concerto form, as they understood it, were really unique to them. Everybody else was somewhere else, let's put it that way. They used the ritornello, for sure, but they didn't use it in the stricter, more intellectual way that the great classical composers used it. And these middle period composers between say, Beethoven and then Mendelssohn, Schumann and Chopin, who we'll deal with at the end of this little chat, they were on the verge of a Romantic piano style, but their model was Mozart, not Beethoven. And they were writing at a time when the piano had undergone huge improvements in size, in its range, in its construction, and in piano technique, which had become vastly more virtuosic, as had violin technique. I mean, it was the period of the emergence of the great Romantic virtuoso artists, instrumental soloists. And so the piano writing is very elaborate, extremely ornamentally lush, as often as not. The tunes are just terrific. The handling of form is much looser than Mozart and Beethoven. By loose, what do you mean? Loose means it's not so much about development. It's about virtuosity, instrumental virtuosity. It's about presentation of a couple good tunes and finding the best way to organize them and leaving it at that. So this version of our fabulous ritornello form begins with an orchestral introduction and all that. But after that, you don't have to worry about the strictness of the organization of the movement at all. It's all about the solo and the beautiful keyboard writing that these composers indulge in. The Hummel concerto, particularly his second piano concerto in A minor, is a gorgeous, gorgeous work. That is Mozart on steroids, you might want to call it, something like that. But you'll listen to it and you'll decide for yourself. We hear the Romantic movement chomping at the bit in Field and Hummel. Field's slow movements are basically nocturnes, by the way. It's just terrific music that doesn't deserve to be neglected. And it's been recorded fairly extensively now, so it's pretty easy to get your ears onto. But after these two, here we are in the Romantic period, and we start with Chopin, which is very interesting. Chopin's 2 piano concertos are quite early works, 1829. Field and Hummel are like 1811 and 1813, respectively, somewhere in there. Beethoven was still very much alive, but the style was moving elsewhere. Isn't that a wonderful thing? I mean, we hear this. The reason these guys are ignored, Hummel and Field, I have to go back. I'm sorry. I have to go back to this and make this point, is because all we care about is Beethoven from this period. But Beethoven was not typical. Beethoven was Beethoven. Music itself was moving in a different direction, and it was not consistent with what Beethoven was doing. It was moving off into the Romantic era. And so because Beethoven is such a dominant figure, we diminish all of these other people and the entire larger current of where music was going during the same period in which Beethoven was alive and active, which we shouldn't be doing. We have brains, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can enjoy Beethoven, and we can enjoy the best of what was on offer by other composers working in different styles. So that's where Field and Hummel come in, and that's the style that won. I mean, it basically won. Beethoven did not. Beethoven was gone. Ka-chung, foof, gone, until Brahms took up the Beethoven Concerto Challenge in just a couple works. Nobody else really did. It was a cul-de-sac, Beethoven's handling of concerto form. The rest of the world was doing other things. So Chopin was one of those guys doing other things, and he started writing typical, ritornellos, which were completely unnecessary by that point because it's all about the gorgeous piano writing. I mean, it's Chopin, right? And people have criticized his handling of form in his first two concertos, his only two concertos, which were written in 1829, 1830, in obsolete form at that time already. How do we know it's obsolete? Well, we know it's obsolete because when you listen to it, you just want to hear the piano. As soon as the piano comes in, we're like, whoa, yes, the piano, thank God. And, the high points of these concerti really are the slow movements, which are just so exquisitely beautiful and melodically rich. So we start with Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 2 of 1829, which is actually his first, but it was published second. And it's widely regarded as the more successful of the pair, but they're both lovely works. They really are. And lots of fun to listen to. And he was only in his 20s when he wrote them. And, we tend to think of Chopin somehow as later. His music is so, I don't know, it's almost, it has no period. It's mysteriously appeared, and it could have appeared any time. It almost sounds his mature work anyway. But the piano concertos are of their epoch. And after Chopin, we've got Mendelssohn, his Piano Concerto No. 1. Now, Mendelssohn, who was a genius akin to Mozart, changed the concerto form forever in his first piano concerto, his two piano concertos, and his violin concerto, the famous one, in E minor, because he just dumped the ritornello. He said, to hell with it. We're going to start right away with the soloist. The soloist is what it's all about. And the orchestra is going to accompany the soloist and interject things when the soloist pauses, as it necessarily must. But the spotlight will be on the soloist from the very first. And thus was born the romantic concerto form, the one that we're most used to, where the orchestra does ta-da, and then the soloist comes banging in if it's a piano or screeching in if it's a violin. And off we go to the races. This, by the way, made first movements much shorter and more compact because you don't have to have that double exposition where the orchestra says everything and then the soloist comes in and does it all over again. None of that. Everyone just starts at the beginning and you're off to the races. And Mendelssohn's first piano concerto does exactly that. It has a little flourish, and then you've got this wonderful exordium for the piano, and the whole piece, which plays essentially in almost a single movement with everything connected to everything else, is only about 20 minutes long. It's short and peppy and full of great tunes, and the tunes of the first movement, the finale, they're related to each other, and it's an extremely tightly knit piece, but in a very different form than the classical concerto and the Baroque concerto. And we're now in the 1830s, and we're only, we're exactly at this point 100 years from where Bach got started, and we're in a totally different world musically. totally different world, which is only amplified and emphasized by our last example, Schumann's Piano Concerto, which begins with the orchestra going, eh, and then the piano goes, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. I mean, it's, your piano is, again, front and center. And it's one of the most, of course, popular and famous works in the entire repertoire. It's full of beautiful, lovely tunes. Even the transitional tunes are gorgeous in this concerto. Da 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 do 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 do, ya da 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 da, ba da 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 da. No, it's so beautiful. It just flows like a river. It's wonderful. And so with the Schumann Piano Concerto, we have arrived at the Romantic period, the Romantic concept of ritornello form and what the concerto is supposed to do. It serves as a vehicle for virtuoso solo work, accompanied by increasingly colorful and lively instrumental or orchestral accompaniment. So there you go, my friends. 100 years of concertos. This is a sample of what you should program in your programathon or whatever you use to listen to music, and give it a shot. As you move through the years, you're going to hear an amazing diversity of music and styles, all wrought, I believe, to a large degree by the fact that communications were very, very different from what they were back in the day. And because today we get to cherry pick the things that we like and think are most important and mistakenly label as general principles, when in fact they were local inspirations by composers, most of whom never went more than 10 miles outside the place of their birth. Well, that's not true. John Field, after all, went from Ireland to St. Petersburg, and Chopin went from Poland to Paris. Musicians tended to get around, actually. They went where the money was and where the jobs were and where their aristocratic patrons hung out. So they did move around. But in their formative years, they tended to stick close to home. And that's what we're hearing. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.